bua ka moruo wa naha, re bua ka dikgwebo le mekgwa eo re etsang le ho reka kapa ho rekisa dintho tse ngata maphelong a rona. Moruo ona wa naha o ama maphelo a rona ka mekgwa e mengata, ebile o ama le maemo a rona a tjhelete. Moruo wa naha o re ama kaofela, mme le rona re ama moruo wa naha ena. Ebe re ka etsang ho netefatsa hore moruo wa naha ya rona wa ntlafala, ho ena le hore re o tlohele hore o mpefale? Re bua ka taba ena kajeno mona ho Rands with Sense. Dumelang Afrika Borwa, ke nna Mmarona Kgwele, ya le amohelang lenanehong le leng hape le kgethehileng la Rands with Sense. Kajeno re tlo bua ka ntho e re amang kaofela ha rona. Re bua ka moruo wa naha, e leng the country's economy. Jwale he, ha re qale ka ho utlwa hore economics e bolelang le hore e ama maphelo a rona jwang.
Economics is a study of people and how they deal with resources. And our resources could mean anything from time to land to property, natural resources, anything basically, and how people make decisions based on the resources that they have. You can look at economics from two perspectives. From microeconomics, it looks at the decision-making of individuals, how they choose to spend their time, how much they choose to buy, to sell, if they choose to go to school or not. Macroeconomics looks at the society as a whole, right? How does everybody's decision-making process influence things as a society level? Individually, you can be influenced by the economy. If the economy is very robust, the economy is good, then it's easier to get a job, it's easier to earn a living, and so there's a relationship there.
Economics, e leng moruo o akaretsa mekgwa eo re fumanang ditlhoko tsa rona le dintho tseo re di batlang. Ebile, o akaretsa le mekgwa eo re etsang, re rekang le ho rekisa dihlahiswa le thepa ka yona. Melao ya supply and demand ke yona e laolang hore mmaraka wa moruo o sebetsa jwang. Mme melao ena e ama tjhelete tsa rona tsatsi le letsatsi. Ha re utlwe hore sena se bolelang.
When we look at things from the consumer's perspective, for example, consumers want to buy shirts, food, and the price of shirts will influence how much shirts the consumer can buy. If the price is very cheap, very little, then consumers can buy lots of shirts. If the price is very high, then consumers can buy maybe just a little shirts. If the price is too high, then consumers can buy no shirts. Right, so in general, the higher the price of something, the less consumers want to buy that thing. Right? And that's what we call the law of demand. And from the producer's side of things, if the price is really low, then no producer wants to produce it because you're not making that much money from doing it. If the price gets a bit higher, then some producers say, well, it makes much sense now, I will go into doing it, as more producers want to produce that. If the price gets really high, then everybody's really interested in making that. And so in general, if the price of something goes higher, more people want to get into producing that commodity. That's what we call the law of supply. So now when you bring demand and supply together, you have the basic laws of demand and supply. On the one hand, you have consumers wanting to buy for as low a price as possible. On the other hand, you have producers wanting to sell for as high a price as possible. And if they negotiate, they eventually meet up at some point where they both agree on a price to sell and a price to buy.
Ekaba ho etsahalang ka moruo wa mona Afrika Borwa matsatsing a? Ebe ke mathata a feng eo re kopanang le ona? Mme a ama maemo a rona a tjhelete jwang?
The South African economy has two big issues. The first is high unemployment, and the second is slow growth. And they're both tied together because growth, especially growth in key sectors, reduces unemployment. And when there's no growth, then it's difficult to see how the unemployment would come down. And of course, unemployment is a social issue. You don't want people to remain unemployed for a long time because it could lead to social problems. In terms of unemployment, you want growth to be in sectors that employ people and lots of people. You want growth to be in labor-intensive industries like manufacturing. Manufacturing typically employs lots of people. On the other hand, mining, especially for some kind of raw materials, doesn't really employ that many people. So you want to focus on sectors that employ lots of people, because if the growth is there, then the unemployment should come down. Because if there's high growth in those sectors, lots of people get employed. If there's growth in sectors that are capital intensive, sectors that don't really use lots of people, then that might not transmit into lower unemployment. It will mean growth, yes, but it won't come with the jobs for people. So it's important to focus on sectors that actually create jobs, sectors that are labor intensive, that can absorb a big part of the labor force.
Moruo wa naha o ama maemo a rona a tjhelete, ebile o ama le maikutlo a rona.
Ons emosionele welstand word deur die ekonomie geraak, hoofsaaklik oor twee redes. Dit veroorsaak vir ons stres, want een, ons ken dit nie, ons verstaan dit nie altyd nie. En twee, dit het 'n impak op ons finansiële vryheid. Mense sal maklik oorweldig voel, angstig raak, gaan ek kan aanhou om my lewe te bekostig soos wat hy is op die oomblik. Gaan ek die maand kan deursien met die nuwe veranderinge. Die tweede rede is hulle word kwaad. Skielik word daar weer van my geld opgeëis deur 'n stelsel wat ek nie verstaan nie. Hulle voel oorweldig, hulle voel buite beheer.
Ho dula re kgathatseile ka mathata a tjhelete, ho ka baka mathata dikamanong tsa rona le batho ba bang. Re ile ra kopa setsebi sa rona hore se re hlalosetse hore sena se ka bakwa ke eng.
Een van die ander faktore in ons lewe wat deur finansiële bekommernis aangeraak word, is verhoudings. Want skielik is dit die enigste ding waaroor daar gepraat of geargumenteer word. Daar's vrae wat ongemaklik is. Daar moet oplossings gevind word en as al die inligting nie beskikbaar is oor die mate of die aard van die finansiële probleme nie, dan kan daar nie saam oplossings gevind word nie. En dit veroorsaak 'n eskalering in konflik tussen partye. Party mense isoleer, hulle hou op om telefone te antwoord, so niemand kan hulle in die hande kry om hulle te probeer help met hulle probleme.
Lebaka le leng le leholo le bakang mathata pakeng tsa baratani ke ho se buisane ka tjhelete ya bona. Kaofela re na le ditlhoko, ditlwaelo le ditabatabelo tse sa tshwaneng, mme ho bohlokwa hore re buisane ka tjhelete ka bolokolohi. Ke tsena dikeletso tse ka thusang wena le moratuwa wa hao hore le be le katleho maemong a lona a tjhelete kamanong ya lona.
Ambani zwine na funa zwone. Roṱhe ri funa zwithu zwo fhambananaho. Ndi ngazwo zwi zwa ndeme u amba nga zwipikwa kha vhushaka. U bva kha ṱhoḓea u ya kha masheleni a ndindakhombo u swikela kha u vha na nnḓu kana goloi. Ambani na mufarisi wanu ni swikelele kha zwine na anḓana khazwo. Dovhani ni vhone zwine a ni anḓani khazwo. Ni wane nḓila ine noṱhe na nga u swikelela zwipikwa zwavho iwe no takala. Itani nzudzanyo u swikelela zwipikwa zwaṋu. Ambani nga nḓila ine na nga fhungudza u tambisa masheleni. Hone vhulungani masheleni aṋu. Ḓiimiseleni u ḓiṱungufhadza. Arali mufarisi wanu o ḓiimisela u fhungudza u tambisa masheleni, na inwi itani nga u ralo. Tshiṅwe hafhu, itani mugaganyagwama u shumelaho noṱhe. Litshani mbiti kha nyambedzano dza zwa masheleni. Zwa dzimbiti zwi anzela u vha mudzi wa zwa thaidzo dzashu dza masheleni. Lingedzani u pfesesa uri ndi ngani ni tshi kwata, u ḓaḓa kana u vhaisala musi u tshi ambuya nga masheleni. Lingani u zwi sedza nga ḽiṱo ḽavhuḓi. u vuda ni tshi khou amba nga ha masheleni ndi zwa ndeme ni tshi ṱoḓa u aluwa kha zwa masheleni. Kovhekanyani vhuḓifhinduleli ha zwa masheleni nga u lingana. Nga u kovhekana vhuḓifhinduleli ha zwa masheleni kha vhushaka, ni ḓo shuma tshithu tshithihi hu si u lwisana. Tsha u fhedzisela, ḓiimiseleni u guda. Zwi a itea vhutshiloni. Ndi zwa ndeme u ḓowela musi zwithu zwi sa khou tshimbila nga nḓila ine wa funa zwi tshi tshimbila ngayo. Ndi ngadzo hu zwa ndeme u vhulunga masheleni na u vha na tshikwama tsha ndindakhombo musi zwo vhifha. Nga heyi nḓila, ni ḓo kona u vhulunga masheleni anu nga Rands with Sense. U wana mafhungo nga vhuḓalo, dalelani randswithsense.co.za na u ṱola siaṱari ḽashu ḽa Facebook.
Dintlha tse bohlokwa e le ka nnete mabapi le dikamano tsa rona. Moruo wa naha o a re ama, mme le rona re ama moruo wa naha. Ebang le rona ka mora papatso, ha re tswela pele ho utlwa ka botlalo ka taba ena. Re le amohela hape. Ke nna Mmarona Kgwele, mme o shebeletse Rands with Sense. Lenaneo le buang ka bolokolohi ka maemo a rona a tjhelete. Kajeno re ithuta ka moruo wa naha le hore o ama maemo a rona a tjhelete jwang. Naha e na le currency e leng tjhelete ya naha, mme currency ena e ama moruo wa naha eno haholo. Re kopile setsebi sa rona hore se re hlalosetse ka taba ena.
Currency is a common means of payment. So in South Africa, our currency is called the South African Rand, and that becomes a standardized unit that people use to basically buy goods and services and sell goods and services. So most countries have got their own currency. For instance, Switzerland, you've got the Swiss franc. In Britain, you've got the British pound. And then you get currency blocks, for instance, like Europe, where they're trying to form a common market with a standardized trade approach to the rest of the world. They've got a common currency, which is obviously called the euro. In the South African context, we're known as an open economy. So we do a lot of trade, import and export. We're quite a balanced economy. Currently, South Africa is importing more value than what it's exporting, which is what's putting a lot of pressure on the rand, which means everybody's selling rands, buying foreign currency. When you sell something, it devalues it. If there's too much of something, it devalues it. So South Africans are trying to get rid of their rands to buy foreign currency to import goods. That has a major effect on our economy. When the rand weakens, all imported products from abroad become more expensive. That means everything that you import becomes more expensive, including things like oil, which we run our motor cars with, and that is a big cost for people running trucks, delivering food, etc., etc. So the direct impact is everything becomes more expensive. So we end up importing less, which has an impact in that there will be less choice on the shelves in the longer term of more expensive products. Because if something becomes too expensive, there comes a point simply where consumers won't be able to afford to buy them. On the converse, this very big weakening of the rand is really good news for the exporters, because the same that for imports reducing, suddenly our goods and services in the global market become a lot cheaper because the rand is cheaper. So what happens is that slowly foreigners will start seeing value in South African exports and start buying more and more of them, which is actually a good thing for our country because we need to increase our exports versus our imports. If the rand is doing well, it's not really good for exports. So that is one of the biggest challenges that South Africa faced the last 5 or 6 years when we had relatively strong rand. Exporters find it very difficult to enter the global markets because our produce was actually seen as quite expensive. So it is ironic, a strong rand can actually be quite bad for the country.
Bongata ba rona re rata hore ha re ne re le banyane re ne re sa hloke tjhelete e ngata jwalo ka mehleng ya kajeno ho reka bohobe le lebese. Selemo le selemo, theko ya ditlhoko le ditshebeletso e dula e nyoloha. Re bua ka ntho e bitswang inflation. Ha re utlwe hore theko ena e phahamang kapa yona inflation ke eng le hore e bakwa ke eng.
Inflation technically is just a change in the price. So what was the price of bread yesterday? What was the price of bread today? And what's the change? That change is what we call inflation. Many things can cause inflation, but there are two big causes. One is rising demand. If more people want to buy bread, for example, but the fundamentals of bread haven't changed, the flour that they used to make bread is still the same, the sugar is still the same, but there's more people who want to buy bread, then the prices of bread will go up, and that is inflation. Right now, on the other hand, the costs of producing bread might change. Right? If the flour itself gets more expensive, or if the wheat gets more expensive, or if the labor involved in producing bread gets more expensive, then that would mean that the price of bread itself has to increase. Right? That isn't driven by people wanting to buy more bread. It's driven by the underlying costs of producing bread. So that also can lead to an increase in the price of bread, which again is inflation. Now it's not just for bread, of course. It's for everything in society. The statistics office takes prices of almost everything you can think of and comes up with a number to say that the prices in general have changed by X amount between yesterday and today. That change is what we call inflation.
Inflation e ka re ama ka mekgwa eo re lebelletseng. Mohlala, ha re re theko ya petrol e a nyoloha. Sena se bolela hore re tlo ntsha tjhelete e ngata ho feta pele ho reka petrol eno. Hape sena se bolela hore theko ya ditlhoko le ditshebeletso tsohle tse sebedisang dipalangwang tse hlokang petrol le tsona di tla nyoloha.
Another example of how inflation affects you directly is through savings. If you have a savings account with a fixed interest rate and inflation goes up, then it means you're not making as much interest as you would before. And in the possible case where inflation becomes higher than the interest you're earning on your savings, then it means you're really losing money. So that's another way through which inflation directly and the economy in general can affect you as an individual.
Ho dula re kgathatseile ka maemo a rona a tjhelete, ho ka re kudisa, mme ho ka re tetebetsa haholo mmeleng le kelellong. Ha re utlwe hore ho etsahalang mmeleng ya rona, ha re kgathatseha ka dintho tse kang maemo a moruo le inflation.
Finansiële stres in ons lewens raak elkeen. Nou, wat gebeur is ons met die stres wat ons elke dag ervaar, is daar elke dag daai suikerblootstelling, verhoogde suikervlakke in ons bloed, verhoogde kortisolvrystelling is 'n hormoon wat in ons byniere vrygestel word, ons streshormoon. Goed en wel, as jy in die korttermyn probleme het, dis waarvoor dit daar is, maar konstant elke dag onder daai kortisolvlak effek sien jy dat ons byniere begin ingee. Ons begin gewigsprobleme kry, konstante pyn, konstante moegheid. Jy staan moeg op in die oggend. 'n craving of wat ons noem 'n drang na souterige kosse, vetterige, hoë proteïenkosse wat ons letterlik dan nou meer gewig veroorsaak, meer suikerprobleme veroorsaak. Konsentrasie, angstigheid wat ons sien daarmee saam, selfs jou toekoms is op die spel. Fertiliteitsprobleme, erektiele disfunksieprobleme, minder hormoon, die sekshormone wat nodig is, word vrygestel. En dit word ook geneties oorgedra aan jou kinders. So dit affekteer nie net jou toekoms nie, maar ook die toekoms van jou kinders en kleinkinders. So nee, dis redelik baie omvatryk. Dit affekteer ons op 'n baie meer maniere as ons regtig dink.
Mmele ya rona le kelello tsa rona di amana le maemo a rona a tjhelete haholo. Ha maemo a moruo a hlobaetse, ho bonolo hore re ka kgathatseha, ebile re ka iphumana re tetebetse maikutlong haholo ha re nahana ka bokamoso ba rona. Ha re utlwe dintlha tse ka re thusang hore re kgone ho phela maphelo a hantle, mmeleng le kelellong ha moruo o na le mathata.
ungahlali ndawonye futhi idla ngendlela efanele. Isiqu sakho kanye nomqondo wakho zisondelene kakhulu. Kulula ukuzizwa ungqono emqondweni uma umzimba wakho uphile kahle. Chitha isikhathi sakho ngaphandle. Hamba wenze isiqiniseko sokuthi udla ukudla okunempilo. Phumula uthole amandla amasha. Ukulala nako kwenza umehluko omkhulu ezimpilweni zethu. Uma uzizwa uphansi futhi ukhathazekile ngesimo sezimali, yenza esiqiniseko sokuthi uyaphumula. Uma ukhathele, izinkinga zakho ziba zinkulu kakhulu. Lwisa imikhuba emibi. Iningi lethu lithola kulula ukubhema, ukuphuza noma ukugembula izingxaki. Kodwa ukuchitha imali yakho oyisebenzele kanzima kule mikhuba angeke kulethe isisombululo ezinkingeni zakho. Zama ukuthola imikhuba emihle, njengokufunda incwadi, ukumeditate, ukwenza ingadi, okanye ukusebenza ngamaplanga. Lokho kuzokhulula ingqondo yakho ukuze ungathathi izinqumo okungasizona. Funa uncedo, ukhulume. Ukukhuluma ngemizwa yakho kungaba nomphumela omuhle. Ukuthula kwenza izinto zibe zimbi kakhulu. Okokugcina, uma ubona ngathi akekho umuntu ongakhuluma naye, cela uncedo. Baningi abochwepheshe abangamamela izinkinga zakho, bakusize ukufumana isisombululo kuzinkinga zakho. Ukwazi kabanzi, vakashela urandswithsense.co.za, uthande ikhasi lethu leFacebook.
Ka mora papatso, re tlo bona hore tswala e sebetsa jwang le hore e ka ama maemo a rona a tjhelete jwang. O se ke wa tsamaya. O shebeletse Rands with Sense. Ka jeno re bua ka moruo wa naha le hore maemo a wona a re ama jwang. Tswala e tsamaisana le moruo. Ebile tswala ke ntho eo bongata ba rona re kopanang le yona maphelong a rona. Ha o etsa sekoloto sa loan, o se patala le tswala.
Interest is basically just a charge on borrowing money. If I give you a loan of 100 Rand, what do I get in return for giving you a loan of 100 Rand? The alternative with no interest would be for me to keep my 100 Rand. But to convince me to give you my 100 Rand, then you have to be willing to pay something extra for that, right? And so the interest rate is the percent extra that you pay on borrowing money.
Eka ba tswala eo re e patalang e kopantshwa jwang? Ebe ke eng se etsang hore e nyolohe kapa e theohe? Ha re fumane tlhahiso leseding ho tswa ho setsebi sa rona.
So there are a few factors which influence the interest rate that the consumer will repay. The first is obviously your credit score. The better your credit score, generally the lower the interest rate you should pay. Also, as a rule of thumb, the larger the institution, the lower the interest rate. So the big banks, as a rule, charge less interest on personal loans than maybe some of the smaller unsecured credit providers out there. And really the final factor that affects the interest rate is the term that the loans are lent over. The longer the term, generally the lower the interest rate. Also, of course, the most important thing is whether that loan is secured or not. So a secured loan would be vehicle finance or home loan where it's secured on an asset. And because it's secured, they charge a far lower interest rate. Whereas unsecured, it's only really secured against the individual, and they have to charge a higher interest rate to compensate for that risk.
So the Reserve Bank is the ultimate backstop for currency. And banks take loans from the Reserve Bank, indirectly anyway. So the repo rate is the rate at which they take those loans. Now, if banks take loans at a higher rate, then it means that the the rate that they give to consumers, to businesses, becomes higher, right? And there's a transmission mechanism in that, but that's the simple way to think about it. If banks have to pay more for loans, then they're going to charge you more to give you loans. Right? If banks have to pay less for loans, then they will charge you less to give you loans. If the repo rate is 4%, for example, then a bank would have to charge something above 4%, let's say 6%. If the repo rate goes up to 5%, then the bank might have to charge 7%. If the repo rate goes down to 3%, then the bank might reduce its rates to 5%. So there's a relationship between the repo rate and the rates that banks eventually charge to customers. So the repo rate is kind of like a guide that influences the interest rates that banks will eventually charge to people, to businesses, to governments, and so on. If you're the most riskless business or riskless person, you have the best record of payment, and you have the best plan to use the loans you want to get, the prime rate is the best possible rate you can get. The more risky you get, the higher the interest you pay. So if you're a bit more risky than the most risk-free person, then you get a rate at prime plus whatever they believe your risk is. If you're very risky, then you get a rate at prime plus big extra. But the prime rate in general is the cheapest possible rate you can get as a customer.
Ja, so 'n bietjie meer inligting rondom die prima koers. So die prima koers is basies gekoppel aan die repo koers. Nou die repo koers is iets wat die monetêre beleidskomitee elke 2 maande hersien. En die banke het dan daar staan 'n verskil tussen die prima koers en die repo koers van basies 3.5%. So as die repo koers byvoorbeeld 6% is die banke se prima koers 9.5%.
It's not. It tends to be standard because there's competition. If you're the best customer in the country, then you can choose between banks. Right? If you can choose between banks, then the bank that offers you the best rate would win, and all the banks know this. So in general, the prime rate tends to be around the same for all the banks because they can't really charge a higher rate than other banks because they would just lose customers to other banks. So in a competitive environment, the prime rate should be the same for all the banks. There's many things people want to buy that they can't afford to pay cash outright. A car, a house are good examples. And you need to take a loan for that. High interest rates mean that you have to pay more for that privilege. If interest is at 20%, then it means you have to pay a lot of interest every year just to own a car. If interest is low at 1%, then it means you have to pay just a little interest every year to own a car. So the interest rate affects you if you participate in financial markets, if you want to take a loan on something that you need now and that you can't pay for in full now. Which of course means high interest rates are not necessarily good for consumers, but low interest rates are a bit better.
Eka ba theko ya tswala e ka ama tšhelete tsa lona jwang? Mme le ka etsang ka maemo ao?
It's very important to know the interest rate on your loan because it can vary so hugely between credit providers. Really what you need to do is get multiple quotes from different credit providers and choose the lowest interest rate. That's actually quite difficult to do because one of the anomalies of the way the credit scores work is the more applications for credit that you do, the more your score deteriorates. So by the time you get to the last credit provider, your score will have deteriorated and you should get be offered a much higher interest rate. But you should definitely shop around for personal loans, definitely shop around for the best interest rate and see what different credit providers will quote you. The reason you have to be so careful and check what your interest rates are is because that's the cost of the loan, that's the cost of you borrowing the money. So if you borrow 10,000 Rand, you need to work out and be shown on the credit agreement exactly how much it's going to cost you in total to repay all that debt. Most consumers are very surprised when they see the total amount that needs to be repaid because that includes the interest rate, that includes the monthly fees, and that includes credit life insurance.
Weet jy, ou moet vir jouself vra, as jy weet dat jou finansiële posisie nie 'n 2, 3, 4% rentekoersverhoging kan weerstaan nie, is dit baie keer 'n goeie gedagte om wel 'n vaste koers te neem. Vaste koerse is soms 1%, 2%, selfs duurder as 'n veranderlike koers. Maar dis maar 'n bietjie van 'n versekeringspolis wat 'n ou uitneem. Kom ons werk met die geval van kliënte wat skuld het by die bank. As jy 'n vaste rentekoers het, natuurlik dan as die rentekoerse op of af gaan, raak dit jou glad nie. As jy 'n veranderlike rentekoers het, wanneer die monetêre beleidskomitee die rentekoerse aanpas op 'n 2-maandelikse basis, kan dit beteken dat jou terugbetaling meer of minder word. As die rentekoerse natuurlik opgaan, sal jou terugbetaling vermeerder. As die rentekoerse afgaan, dan sal jy 'n bietjie verligting kry op jou terugbetaling. Kliënte probeer baie keer rentekoerse raai wat 'n rigting rentekoerse gaan en dis nie iets wat ons regtig aanbeveel nie. Jy moet maar kyk na jou eie finansiële posisie en as jy voel jy daai beskerming nodig van 'n vaste koers, is dit iets wat ons regtig aanbeveel dat kliënte sal oorweeg.
Ha re ke re utlwe dikeletso tse ka re tshireletsang mabapi le tswala e dulang e nyoloha kgafetsa.
Fokotsa dikoloto. Ge eba o na le kgatlhego ya nako e kopana ya dikoloto tša lebenkele la credit card, e patele ka pela ka mo o kgonegago. Fokotsa ditshenyagalelo. Fokotsa dikoloto tša gago tše o ka kgonago go phela ka ntle le tšona gore o tle o kgone go boloka. Adima bonnyane gore o kgone go lefela. Se se tlo kgontšišiša gore o kgona go emela dikhuetšo tša kokeletšo. Ge o nyaka go dira mokitlane, o kopanye tše o ka di kgonago go di adima ge e ba dikoketšo di rotoga ka 5%. Ge o sa kgone go lefela ditswalo tšeo, adima ka tlase. Lokiša dikadimo tša gago. Ge e ba o tšea mokitlana wa ntlo, hlokomela. Lokiša loan rate magareng ga mengwaga e 5 le o tee. O tlo kgona go lefela dikokeletšo go sa kgathalelego gore go direga eng, dira se ge fela o tlo kgona. Go tshedimošetšo le dikeletšo tše kgolo, etela randswithsense.co.za goba letlakala la Facebook.
E ka ba tshepo e teng kapa re tla dula re laolwa ke maemo a moruo go fihlella? Dula le rona go utlwe gore re ka ba le Rands with Sense jwang ha re kgutla papatsong. Haeba ke hona o kenang, re a o amohela mona ho Rands with Sense. Lenaneo le buang ka bokamoso ba rona ba tjhelete. Ka jeno re ithuta ka hore moruo o re ama jwang le hore rona re ama moruo ona jwang. Re se re buile ka hore theko ya tswala e ama moruo jwang le hore e re ama jwang ha re etsa sekoloto. Fela na, ebe wa tseba hore ho na le mefuta e mmedi ya dikoloto eo re tshwanelang ho e tseba?
So there's sometimes a misconception that all debt is bad, which is not true at all. In my belief, you have good debt and you have bad debt. Good debt helps you create wealth, helps you generate more money from that debt. So an example of that would be buying a home, borrowing money to buy a home. You hope that over time that house price will increase and your home improvements to it will increase the value, and you'll then be able to sell that property for more than you bought it for. Another example would be borrowing money to start a business. Is that you're borrowing that money because you're hoping you'll get a better return from that money than the cost of borrowing the money. Borrowing money to buy a car, if that enables you to get from home to work to get a better paid job, then that's a good debt. Of course, you have to buy a car within reason, and I'd much rather you went out there and saved money for 2 years and bought an old banger rather than went out and bought a new car off the showroom. Anything else really should be for emergencies or it's bad debt. Anything
whatever you do, don't go out and buy your monthly groceries on credit, because you're just starting on the debt spiral. And don't go out and buy that piece of furniture or that television on credit. Save up the money and buy it on cash, because that doesn't produce any money. That does not have a wealth effect.
The good debt, bad debt idea also applies to economies. Economies also take loans. Governments also take loans. And what the government uses the loans for determines if it's a good debt or a bad debt. If a government takes loans to build a highway, which helps businesses become more productive, that's a good debt. If the government takes loans to build a power plant, which helps improve the power situation, that's a good debt. On the other hand, if the government takes loans to pay salaries, then that's not a very good debt. So just as you have for individuals, you can have for governments and economies as well. You can have good debt and bad debt.
How will you consume kapa motho ya sebedisang sekoloto o sa se patala? Kgatlamelo bohloko hampe e qala ka moo le sekoloto se nkileng teng. Ba nkileng sekoloto bona ba sitwa ho patala di-rent tsa bona, ba sitwa ho patala di-salary tsa bona, di-phone tsa bona, tje bophelo ba business eo bo ya fatshe. Hona le hore ho hiro motho mong mohlomong wa bohlano wa botshelela moo ho fokotswa e mong ka baka la sekoloto sa hao kae se shortisting everything. Ya bobedi, moruong le moruo o ameha jwalo fela in a bigger scale. Cheka o le ameha company e nyenyane le moruo o ameha jwalo. O ifumana moruo o sa kgone ho etsa tjhelete e nngwe, batho ba sa kgone ho fumana ho phela ka baka la sekoloto se sa patala.
Every time you take a loan, the money doesn't come from thin air. It's somebody else who has given that loan to you. So if you don't pay your loan back, then it means on the flip side, the person who gave a loan to you has lost money. And what this means is that next time he or she is less likely to want to give a loan at all. It means next time around, maybe I think twice about giving you a loan at all. And of course, if individuals can't get loans, if business can't get loans, then that's bad for the economy. As an economy as a whole, if lots of people don't pay back their loans, then the risk for the economy as a whole is higher, which means people want to lend the economy money less, which really means you have to pay high interest rate just to get any loans.
Hare qetella re kare ha sa patale dikotso hantle o iphumana o tswile ho ba e mong ya thusang kapa ya tshehetsang tsamaiso ya economy ya moruo wa lefatshe leo o phelang ho lona. Ka mantswe a mang, kae South Africa e tla kgineha kae ka baka la ho sa patala sekoloto ha motho ya le mong o na le tshitiso a etsang mmusong.
So the question is, why would credit providers or banks lend to somebody who can't foreseeably repay that loan? The reason that they can do that is because the consumers who do repay pay such high fees and costs that actually it offsets the consumers who don't pay. So if you look, for example, at the furniture retailers across the industry, their non-performing loans are running at 55%. So that means every 100 people they lend to, only 45 will actually repay that loan. The other 55 will not repay that loan. But they make so much money out of the 45 who repay that actually it means it's still a profitable business. So really the question is, who's the fool in this scenario? Is it the person who is not paying their loan back, or is it the person who's paying their loan back because they're paying for everybody else?
Ho bohlokwa ho qoba sekoloto se ka o kenyang mathateng hobane se sa o lokela. Dikeletso tse tla le thusa ho qoba sekoloto se sebe kapa se sa le lokelang ke tsena.
Pele ga o ka ntsha sekoloto, ipotse dipotso tse di latelang. Go adima madi a, go tla tswela dikgwetlo tsa ka tsa madi mosola na? A na ke ile ka batlana le theko eo e ntshiametseng na? A na ke adima madi a ka theko e ko tlase na? A ke tla kgona fa tswala e ka tlhatlhoga ka moso? Na ke tla kgona go duela kgwedi le kgwedi? A na ke tlhaloganya di-terms and conditions tsotlhe tsa sekoloto na? A na ke tlhaloganya ditlamorago le dikotsi tseo di ka diragalang fa dilo di ka senyega mme ke sa kgone go duela sekoloto? Fa o ka araba nnyaa go dipotso tse, go bolela gore o tshwanetse o inagane gape mabapi le go tsaya sekoloto. Fa o batla dintlha mabapi le go efoga sekoloto se se maswe, ya go randswithsense.co.za o re etele gape mo Facebook.
O shebeletse Rands with Sense, lenaneo le buang ka tjhelete le tshebediso e nepahetseng ya yona. Re tla qala ho laola le ho lokisetsa bokamoso ba rona ba tjhelete hantle ha re ka tseba hore moruo o sebetsa jwang le hore o re ama jwang. Ha re ke re utlwe mahlale le dikeletso ho tswa ho ditsebi tsa rona tse hlwahlwa.
As an individual, you have to be aware of the realities. You have to know that there's inflation. You have to be aware of what inflation is. You have to know what inflation means to be able to protect yourself from inflation. You have to know that interest rates might rise or fall. You have to be aware of all these things. And of course, you have to take steps to protect yourself from any of the changes that might happen. For example, if you know that the inflation is about 6%, which means that the price of everything will rise by about 6% every year, then you have to plan to increase your salary by 6%. But you have to plan to do a bit more work to make sure that you can make up for the 6% that the 6% change in prices. So you have to be aware of the changes in society, and you have to try to define your actions based on what you expect the changes to be. Sometimes interest rates will go up and you really lose some cash. Sometimes stock markets will go down and you lose some cash there, but everything can go down at the same time. So the tip to surviving is to spread your options, to spread your money in different options. In theory, everything can collapse at once. So if you're well spread out, then even if something goes bad, the rest can still keep you afloat.
So se ra hore re swantse hore ha re lo lebella re le hlahloba mehuta ya di-account tse di leng gona tša go saver kapa tsona tša go investa, re kgopele go bontšhwa di-account tše e leng gore di na le interest rate ya go hlalefa. So lebella dilo tša mohutong gore ha eba o na le tšhelete ya go bonala e dutšeng ka gare ga account ya gago, mohlomong e ntšhe o itsenye go account mo e tla thomang go gola ntshe, saving account, investment account, ka ge re boletše tše di tla go tšwela mogola. So re se ka tlogela tšhelete e dutše go di-account tše e leng gore ga di na interest rate ya go bonala. E ba le poledišano le di-consultants ka bankeng, ba go hlalosetše gore ba na leng ka bankeng ya bolena mehuta di-account e ka e šomišang e šoma bjang, botšiša gore o humane tlhaloso, so that ga le fetša go bolela o humane account e leng gore e tlo go šomela ya go thuša ebile le tšhelete ya gago ya gola.
Ho bohlokwa ho netefatsa hore o phela hantle mmeleng le kelellong ka dinako tseo moruo o hlobaetsang.
Omdat daar ekonomiese besluite geneem word waaroor ons geen beheer het nie, maar wat ons die gevolge van moet verduur, is daar 'n paar strategieë wat 'n mens kan aanwend om hiermee te probeer saamleef. Die eerste hiervan is jy gaan met betyds inligting inwen en advies inwin, sodat jy kan weet hoe om jouself te help. Het sy jy 'n kundige moet raadpleeg vir beter finansiële bestuur, het sy jy net met die mense rondom jou moet praat, soos jou familie, jou spouse, om te kan sê, maar luister, ons gaan dinge nou anders moet doen. Ons gaan met herbeplan, ons gaan sekere uitgawes moet heroorweeg of moet sny. So gaan terug na die drawing board, wil ek amper sê. Begin praat, betyds, deel al die inligting sodat dit alles op die tafel is, dat mens kan weet wat moet jy oorweeg om 'n beter oplossing te vind en begin dit implementeer. Want ons kan nie die ekonomie voorsê nie, maar ons kan binne die raamwerk van die ekonomie beter beplan en sodoende probeer om finansiëel te oorleef. Deur hierdie te doen, neem jy beheer terug en jy gaan minder magteloos voel, minder hulpeloos voel en dit gaan 'n positiewe effek op jou emosionele welstand hê.
Ons is geseën met een liggaam. Jy het een liggaam gekry wat jy moet oppas, wat jy moet beskerm. En soos ek sê, elke ou is vatbaar vir die aanslag van die lewe. Elke ou man en vrou is vatbaar vir die negatiewe effekte op van die lewe. En dit is jou plig teenoor jouself, maar ook die mense rondom jou, om jou liggaam te beskerm, om goed na jouself te kyk en goed vir jouself te sorg deur jou basiese goeders te doen. Gaan stap in die middag as jy by die huis kom na werk. Gaan speel met jou kinders, jy kry energie daardeur. Mens kry, al is jy fisies moeg, deur daai klein goedjies te doen, deur saam met jou familie tyd te spandeer, kry jy letterlik energie. Dit is jou plig, nie net teenoor jouself nie, maar teenoor jou kinders, jou familie, jou omgewing en jou gemeenskap rondom jou.
Moruo wa naha o re ama kaofela ha rona, mme diqeto, diketso le ditlwaelo tsa rona le tsona di ama moruo ona wa naha ya rona. Le ha ho ka ba boima haholo bophelong, re hloka ho netefatsa hore re nahanisa dintho hantle ha re etsa qeto tsa tjhelete. Ho inahana hantle ka maemo a rona a tjhelete le ho ibolokela mathata a kamoso ho ka re fa menyetla e metle ya ho fumana tokoloho mabapi le tjhelete tsa rona. Jwale he, ke le siya ka dikeletso tsa rona tse tharo tsa ka mehla. Ya pele, eketsa tjhelete e kenang. Ya bobedi, fokotsa tjhelete e tswang. Ya boraro, etsa dintho tsena ka bobedi ba tsona. Ke nna Mmarona Kgwele, dulang le etsa Rands with sense ka mehla ma Afrika Borwa. Salang hantle.